Winter. The year 916. The northern wind carries ash across 1,000 miles of grass. Inside one felt tent, a man sits awake. He has not slept. He will not sleep. Today, everything changes. A nomadic chieftain declares himself emperor, not of a tribe, not of a confederation, emperor of a dynasty that will stand for 200 years and force China itself to call him equal. How does a horseman become an emperor? How do nomads who write nothing, build nothing permanent, who follow grass and water with the seasons, how do they create an empire that outlasts most Chinese dynasties? The answer lies in a story China tried to forget, a story of a people who refused to disappear. The Khitan. They built an empire so sophisticated that their name became the word for China itself across half of Asia. Cathay, Khitan, Cathayan. Names that echo still, but in China's official histories, they are footnotes. Barbarians, northern invaders who happened to get lucky. The victors wrote them out, erased them. Tonight, we remember. Chapter 1. The Edge of the World. To understand the Khitan, you must first understand their world. A place where empires end, where civilization frays, where the map becomes uncertain. The Mongolian-Manchurian frontier, 900 years after Christ. A landscape that defies simple description. Here, the great northern forests meet the endless steppe. Thick woods of larch and birch give way to grassland that rolls to horizons that never end. In winter, temperatures plunge to 40 below. In summer, the grass grows higher than a horse's belly. This is marginal land. Too cold for intensive farming. Too heavily wooded in places for pure nomadism. Neither China nor the steppe, a borderland, and borderlands create a certain kind of people. The Khitan lived between worlds. In summer, they moved with their herds, horses, sheep, cattle, following the grass as it greened across the steppe. In winter, they retreated to semi-permanent camps at the forest edge, hunting deer and wild boar, fishing the frozen rivers. They were neither purely nomadic nor settled. They rode like Mongols, but also knew how to work wood and stone. They hunted like forest people, but also grazed vast herds. Hybrid people, adaptive people. The Chinese called them barbarians, but the Chinese call everyone barbarians. To the south lay China, the Tang Dynasty in its declining years, once the most powerful empire on earth. But by the 9th century, rebellions tear it apart. Provincial warlords ignore the emperor. The frontier becomes lawless. To the north, the great steppe powers rise and fall. The Turkic Khaganate had collapsed. The Uyghurs would soon follow. Power vacuums open across Central Asia. And the Khitan? They are trapped between these giants. Subject people, tributaries. They send horses and furs to Chinese courts. They bow to Turkic Khans. They survive by being useful to those more powerful. But they watch and they learn. The Khitan organized themselves into 8 tribes, 8 great clans, each with their own grazing territories, their own leaders, their own traditions. The Yila tribe, the Shiwi, the Nawe, the Pinmo, the Telai, the Wogu, the Wokuili, the Nieli, These were not random groupings. Each tribe claimed descent from ancient ancestors. Each had sacred lands. Marriage alliances bound them together, but also pulled them apart. Unity was always temporary, always fragile. Leadership rotated among the tribes. Every 3 years, a new chieftain would be chosen by council. No hereditary power, no permanent authority. This prevented any single clan from dominating. It kept the peace, but it also kept them weak. Imagine the problem. 8 tribes, 8 sets of ambitions, 8 versions of what the Khitan should be. Some wanted to remain nomadic, pure, free. Others saw the wealth of settled peoples and wanted it. Some sought closer ties with China. Others feared Chinese influence would corrupt Khitan ways. Every 3 years, they argued, they made temporary alliances. They chose a new leader who would try to balance all these competing interests. And then, 3 years later, they did it again. It kept them alive, but it also kept them trapped. But trade continued. It always does. Khitan horses were famous across China. Strong, hardy, perfect for cavalry. Chinese merchants came north to buy them. They brought silk, iron tools, tea, bronze mirrors. In the market towns along the frontier, 2 worlds met. Chinese merchants weighed silver. Khitan horsemen haggled in broken Chinese. Goods changed hands. Information changed hands. The Khitan learned Chinese writing. Not all of them, but enough. They learned how the Chinese organized armies, how they kept records, how they taxed and administered vast territories. They learned what an empire actually was. And they learned about Buddhism. Chinese monks traveled the frontier, building temples, seeking converts. Some Khitan were curious. Here was a religion that crossed borders, that united people across cultures, that offered structure, ritual, cosmic order. Traditional Khitan religion was shamanic, spirits in the rocks and rivers, ancestor worship, sky gods, and earth gods. It worked for a nomadic life, but could it hold together an empire? Buddhism offered something different: monasteries, written scriptures, a hierarchy that mirrored imperial administration. The Khitan paid attention. Not all converted, not even most, but enough to matter, enough to plant seeds. Winter nights in Khitan lands, the cold so intense it burns, the stars so clear you feel you could touch them. Inside the yurts, families gather around fires. Elders tell stories. Children learn the names of ancestors going back generations. This is when history is made, not in battle, not in grand councils, but in stories passed from mouth to mouth, in memories preserved, in identities formed. Who are we? Where did we come from? What makes us Khitan? The answers mattered, because identity is what holds people together when everything else tears them apart. The Khitan believed they came from the marriage of a man who rode down from the sky on a white horse and a woman who rode up from the earth on a gray ox. They met at a sacred river. From their union, the 8 tribes were born. Origin myths. Every people has them. But this one mattered because it encoded a truth. The Khitan were people of both sky and earth. Nomadic riders and settled hunters, mobile and rooted, steppe and forest. This duality was not a weakness. It was their strength, their identity, their way of being in the world. But it also created tension. Which path forward? Remain nomadic and free but weak? Or settle, organize, build, and risk losing who they were? Among the Yila tribe, the strongest clan, a young man named Abaoji was making a name for himself. Born in the year 872, he came from the most powerful lineage within the Yila. His father had been an important chieftain, his uncle even more so. But Abaoji wanted more than inherited position. He wanted to prove himself. He gathered warriors, led raids against rival tribes, defeated bandits threatening the trade routes, made alliances through marriage. He would eventually have multiple wives, each alliance strengthening his position. He was brilliant, charismatic, utterly ruthless when necessary. And he understood something his rivals did not. The old system was dying. The rotating leadership system had worked for generations, but times were changing. China was fragmenting. The steppe was in chaos. Raiders from all directions threatened Khitan lands. The frontier needed strong, consistent leadership, not a new chieftain every 3 years learning the job. Abaoji saw this. In 905, when he was 33 years old, the tribal council elected him Kagan, supreme chieftain. It was supposed to be temporary. 3 years, not to step down, but to stay in power. In 907, the Tang Dynasty fell. After nearly 300 years, one of history's greatest empires simply collapsed. The last emperor abdicated. China shattered into competing kingdoms. The period the Chinese call the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms began. Chaos, warlords carving out territories, armies marching and countermarching, refugees fleeing in all directions, the world's most sophisticated civilization tearing itself apart. For the Khitan, this was the moment. Opportunity disguised as catastrophe. Abaoji made his move. He surrounded himself with advisors, not just Khitan warriors, but Chinese scholars who could read and write, Buddhist monks who understood diplomacy. He studied how the Tang Dynasty had governed, how they collected taxes, how they maintained armies, how they kept records. He began introducing Chinese administrative practices slowly, carefully, creating positions that answered only to him, building a bureaucracy loyal to him personally, not to the tribal system. The other tribal leaders grew nervous. This was not how things were done. This was not the Khitan way. In 909, his 3-year term ended. The council gathered to choose a new Kagan. Abaoji refused to step down. The council erupted. This was betrayal. This was tyranny. The entire system depended on rotation, on balance, on preventing exactly this one man seizing permanent power. The tribal leaders demanded he honor tradition. Step down, accept a new Kagan. Some threatened rebellion. Others simply walked out. Abaoji stood firm. He argued the Khitan needed strong, continuous leadership. China was fragmenting. External threats were growing. Changing leaders every 3 years was suicide. But beneath the words, everyone understood the truth. This was a coup, dressed in logic, wrapped in necessity, but a coup nonetheless. Some tribes accepted his refusal to step down. The Yila, his own people, stood with him. Others who had benefited from his military leadership stayed loyal. He had warriors. He had wealth from successful raids. He had Chinese advisors teaching him statecraft. But several tribes openly defied him. Civil war threatened. The Khitan could tear themselves apart before they even had a chance to become something greater. Abaoji chose a middle path, brutal but calculated. He attacked the most vocal opposition tribes, not to annihilate them, but to break their leadership. Night raids, swift, precise. He captured rival chieftains, forced submissions, took hostages to ensure loyalty. It was not total war. It was calculated violence, just enough to make resistance too costly, just enough to demonstrate that he had the strength to enforce his will. The message was clear: accept my leadership or face consequences you cannot afford. One by one, the resistant tribes submitted, some sincerely, some waiting for another chance to rebel. But they submitted. They acknowledged Abaoji as permanent Khagan. In return, he showed calculated mercy. He did not execute the defeated leaders. He incorporated them into his emerging administration, gave them positions, bound them to his system. It was governance, not just conquest, building a structure that would outlast any single conflict. And then Abaoji did something that shocked the traditional Khitan to their core. He began building cities, permanent cities, with walls, with palaces, with Chinese-style administrative buildings. For a nomadic people, this was revolutionary, almost heretical. Cities meant staying in one place. Cities meant giving up the freedom of movement that defined Khitan identity. But Abaoji understood what cities represented: power, control, legitimacy. Every great empire had capital cities. China had Chang'an. The way to be taken seriously was to build something permanent. He recruited Chinese architects and engineers. They designed palaces using Tang Dynasty models, but incorporated Khitan elements. The result was hybrid architecture, Chinese in structure and technique, Khitan in decoration and spirit. Traditional Khitan saw it as corruption, betrayal, selling out to Chinese culture. Abaoji argued it was adaptation, evolution, taking the best from both worlds. The tension was real, and it would never fully resolve. But Abaoji pressed forward. In the year 916, Abaoji declared himself emperor, not Khagan, not chieftain, emperor. Taizu, grand progenitor of a new dynasty. The Liao Dynasty, Liao. The name came from the Liao River that flowed through their territory. It meant nothing special in Chinese, but to the Khitan, it meant home. The river valley where their civilization was born. The ceremony mixed Chinese imperial ritual with Khitan traditions. Buddhist monks chanted, shamans performed sacrifices. Chinese officials prostrated themselves. Khitan warriors roared approval. It was theater, spectacle, a statement to the world. We are no longer nomadic tribes. We are an empire. Treat us accordingly. That evening, alone in his palace chambers, What did Abaoji think? Did he feel triumph or the weight of what he had done? He had broken centuries of tradition, centralized power that had always been distributed, declared himself equal to the Chinese emperor, an almost blasphemous claim in the eyes of Chinese civilization. There was no going back. He had burned the bridges behind him. The Khitan would transform into something new, or they would fall. Everything now depended on whether he could make this work. Chapter 2: Building the Machine. Abaoji's first challenge as emperor was creating an actual government. The Khitan had never had one. They had tribal councils, temporary leaders, oral traditions, no written records, no tax collection, no permanent institutions. He needed to build from scratch, and fast. He recruited hundreds of Chinese officials, scholars who had fled the collapsing Tang Dynasty, men who knew how to run an empire, how to organize ministries, how to collect taxes and maintain records, how to make the machinery of state function. But he did not simply copy China. That would have alienated the Khitan completely. Instead, he created a dual system, a Chinese bureaucracy running parallel to Khitan tribal structures. Chinese officials governed the settled Chinese populations the Liao controlled. They collected taxes, maintained roads, administered justice using Chinese law. They wrote in Chinese characters, followed Chinese administrative models. Khitan tribal leaders governed the Khitan themselves. They maintained traditional grazing rights, settled disputes according to Khitan custom, led Khitan cavalry units, preserved Khitan culture. Two systems, one empire, both answering to Abaoji. It was brilliant and completely unstable. The Chinese officials looked down on the barbarian Khitan. The Khitan resented the effete Chinese. Abaoji had to constantly balance both sides, prevent either from dominating, keep them cooperating despite mutual contempt. But Abaoji never forgot where Khitan power truly came from. The horse, the bow, the ability to strike fast and vanish faster. Khitan cavalry remained the core of the army, light horsemen who could ride all day and fight all night. Each warrior trained from childhood. Each owned multiple horses. Each could shoot a bow accurately at full gallop. This was their advantage. Chinese armies were larger but slower, more heavily armored, but less mobile. In open terrain, Khitan cavalry could run circles around them, hit the flanks, raid the supply lines, avoid direct confrontation until the moment was perfect. Abaoji modernized the cavalry without destroying its essence. He introduced some Chinese organizational methods, better logistics, written orders, supply management. But he kept the traditional cavalry tactics that made the Khitan fearsome. Chinese smiths taught Khitan metalworkers advanced techniques, better steel, more efficient forges. Chinese armor was superior to traditional Khitan leather and felt, but Khitan designs were more practical for cavalry. The result, hybrid armor, Chinese metallurgy, Khitan design, composite bows improved with Chinese wood treatments and lacquers. Arrows became more standardized, more reliable. Swords combined Chinese forging methods with Khitan curved blades optimized for cavalry. Technology transfer. Cultural exchange. Whether the traditionalists liked it or not, the Liao Empire was becoming something neither purely Khitan nor purely Chinese, a hybrid, a fusion. Abaoji also promoted Buddhism aggressively. He built monasteries, invited famous monks from China and Korea, sponsored translations of Buddhist texts, supported monastic communities with land grants and tax exemptions. Why? Buddhism served multiple purposes. It was a legitimizing religion. The great empires of Asia, China, Korea, Japan were all Buddhist. Adopting Buddhism signaled that the Liao were civilized, not barbarians, worthy of respect. Buddhism also provided an institutional structure independent of both Khitan tribes and Chinese bureaucracy. Monasteries became schools, hospitals, banks. They created literate class of monks who could read and write. They preserved knowledge. They served as cultural bridges. And perhaps most importantly, Buddhism preached loyalty to the emperor, the divine right to rule, cosmic order with the emperor at the center. This was useful for a man who had seized power by force. But Abaoji did something even more ambitious. He ordered the creation of a Khitan writing system. The Khitan had no written language. They borrowed Chinese characters when they needed to write anything. This made them culturally dependent on China. Abaoji wanted the Khitan to write their own language in their own script, to preserve their culture, their identity, their independence. Scholars worked for years. They created the Khitan large script, adapted from Chinese characters, but modified to write Khitan language. Later, they developed the Khitan small script, more streamlined, more phonetic. It was revolutionary. Most nomadic peoples never developed writing. The Khitan did, because Abaoji understood that empires need written records, written laws, written history. The script never fully replaced Chinese in administration. Too many documents, too much precedent already existed in Chinese, but it allowed Khitan culture to be recorded, preserved, protected from erasure. And behind Abaoji, supporting him, sometimes guiding him, was Empress Shulu Ping. She was no mere consort. She was a political force in her own right. From the Yila tribe, like Abaoji, she understood tribal politics intimately. She helped manage the traditional chieftains when they grew restless. She led her own military campaigns when Abaoji was occupied elsewhere. She held court, made decisions, punished traitors. In Khitan culture, women could hold significant power, own property, lead, fight. The Chinese found this shocking. Chinese women were expected to be submissive, hidden, powerless. Khitan women could ride, hunt, and rule. Shulu Ping embodied this. When Abaoji needed someone ruthless, he turned to her. She would become one of the most powerful women in Chinese history, though China tried to write her out too. By the late 920s, the Liao Empire was functioning. Not perfectly, never perfectly. The tensions between Khitan and Chinese, between nomadic and settled, between tradition and innovation, these never disappeared. But it worked well enough. Chinese farmers paid taxes and lived under Chinese law. Khitan herders followed traditional patterns and answered to tribal leaders. Both groups contributed to the empire. Both benefited from its protection and trade opportunities. Abaoji had created something unique, a dual empire, a hybrid state. It was messy, complicated, full of contradictions, but it was stable, and it was growing. Chapter 3: The Empire Expands. Abaoji was not content with consolidation. He had ambitions. The Liao would not just survive, they would dominate. To the east lay the Bohai Kingdom, also called Balhae, a state that controlled much of Manchuria and parts of the Korean peninsula. The Bohai were sophisticated. They had cities, agriculture, a Chinese-style bureaucracy. They claimed to be the successors to the ancient Goguryeo kingdom. They were also vulnerable. Internal divisions, succession disputes, and they sat on territory that Abaoji wanted. In 926, Abaoji launched a massive invasion. This was not a raid, this was conquest. The campaign was brutal. The Liao army, 50,000 strong, some sources say even more, swept through Bohai territory. City after city fell. The Bohai army, smaller and less experienced, could not stop them. Abaoji employed Chinese siege techniques combined with Khitan mobility. His cavalry cut off escape routes and supply lines. His Chinese engineers built siege equipment. The combination was devastating. The Bohai capital fell in the dead of winter. The last king surrendered. The kingdom that had existed for 200 years ceased to exist. Abaoji annexed the entire territory, absorbed its population, incorporated its administrative structure. This was empire building at scale. Abaoji installed a military governor, deported much of the Bohai aristocracy to Liao territory, removing potential resistance leaders. He settled Khitan herders on Bohai lands. He renamed cities, reorganized provinces. He was systematic, thorough. This was not just military conquest. This was administrative absorption, making Bohai territory functionally part of the Liao Empire, preventing it from ever reconstituting as an independent kingdom. The Bohai culture would gradually disappear. Their language faded. Their identity dissolved into the Liao system. This was the price of defeat, cultural erasure. But for the Liao, it was a triumph. They had defeated a sophisticated kingdom, proven they could conquer settled civilizations, not just raid nomadic tribes. But Abaoji would not enjoy his victory long. On the return journey from Bohai, he fell ill. Exhaustion, disease. The brutal winter campaign had taken its toll. He was 54 years old. He had ruled for 20 years, built an empire from scattered tribes. He tried to continue, ordered the army to press on toward the capital. But his condition worsened. Fever, weakness. The physicians could do nothing. In the late summer of 1926, somewhere on the grasslands between Bohai and home, Abaoji died. The empire went into mourning. But this was not just grief. This was crisis. Abaoji had held everything together through force of personality and political genius. What would happen now? Traditional Khitan custom demanded human sacrifice when a great leader died. Close companions, servants, favorite horses killed to accompany him to the afterlife. Empress Shuluping went further. She personally cut off her right hand, had it placed in Abaoji's tomb, a gesture of devotion so extreme it became legendary. Whether it actually happened or was later propaganda, the story reveals something important. The succession was not guaranteed. Power had to be claimed, demonstrated, proven. Abaoji's tomb was built on a massive scale. Chinese-style tumulus, underground chambers filled with treasures, stone statues lining the spirit path, horses sacrificed and buried, Chinese luxury goods, Khitan weapons and armor, Buddhist scriptures. The tomb symbolized everything he had built, Chinese in form, Khitan in spirit, Buddhist in blessing, hybrid, just like the empire. But the real question was, who would rule that empire now? Abaoji had multiple sons from multiple wives. The succession was unclear. Traditional Khitan custom said the tribes should choose, but Abaoji had broken traditional custom. He had made the position hereditary. Empress Xu Luping favored her second son, Daguang. He was capable, educated, diplomatic, but the eldest son, Bei, had his own supporters, military commanders, traditional nobles who wanted a return to Khitan ways. The empire teetered on the edge of civil war. Everything Abaoji had built could shatter in succession conflict. Xu Luping moved decisively. She held regency power, controlled the capital, had the loyalty of key generals. She negotiated, made promises, threatened, used every political tool available. A compromise was reached. Bei would rule briefly as emperor, satisfying his supporters and maintaining his honor. But he would then abdicate in favor of Daguang. A political solution. Everyone saved face. Civil war was avoided. Bei ruled for only 2 years. He was capable but understood the reality. His mother and brother controlled the power structures. In 1927, he stepped down, took a lesser title, devoted himself to scholarship and poetry. He became one of the most educated Khitan of his generation, collected Chinese books, wrote poetry in both Chinese and Khitan, corresponded with Chinese intellectuals, a cultured man. But politically sidelined, Daguang became Emperor Taizong, grand ancestor, second emperor of the Liao Dynasty. He was different from his father, more Chinese in education and outlook, more interested in culture and diplomacy than military conquest, more willing to work with the Chinese bureaucracy. But he was also his mother's son, political, calculating, determined to expand Liao power, just using different methods. The succession crisis had been resolved. The empire had survived its first major test. Now it would face its greatest challenge yet, China itself. Chapter 4. The 16 Prefectures. China remained divided. The 5 Dynasties period, a parade of short-lived kingdoms ruling northern China, each claiming to be the legitimate successor to the Tang, each fighting the others for supremacy. The later Tang, the later Jin, the later Han, the later Zhou, dynasties lasting decades at most, sometimes just years. Emperors murdered, coups and counter-coups, civil war as the normal state of affairs. Into this chaos, the Liao watched and waited. and prepared to take advantage. In 936, a Chinese warlord named Shi Jingtang needed help. He was rebelling against the later Tang Dynasty. He wanted to seize the throne, but he needed military support. He turned to the Liao, offered a deal. Help me become emperor, and I will give you territory. Not just any territory, the 16 prefectures, the most strategic region in northern China. This was an astonishing offer. The 16 prefectures included part of the Great Wall defenses, mountain passes, the natural defensive barrier protecting northern China from steppe invasions. Taizong understood what he was being offered. The keys to China. Taizong agreed. He mobilized the Liao army. 50,000 cavalry swept south into Chinese territory. They struck the later Tang forces like a hammer, fast, overwhelming. The later Tang, already weakened by internal divisions, could not resist. Within months, Shi Jingtang controlled northern China. He declared himself emperor of a new dynasty, the later Jin, and he kept his promise to the Liao. He surrendered the 16 prefectures, handed them over, the most valuable real estate in East Asia, given away to secure a throne. The Chinese were appalled. Historians would call it one of the greatest strategic blunders in Chinese history. Shi Jingtang became known as the Child Emperor because he had called Taizong father in the treaty. A Chinese emperor calling a barbarian ruler father. Unthinkable. But the damage was done. The Liao now controlled the natural defenses of northern China. Chinese fortifications now defended Liao territory. Chinese cities paid taxes to Khitan emperors. Chinese farmers grew food for Khitan armies. And there was one more detail. The treaty required the later Jin to pay the Liao 300,000 bolts of silk every year. 300,000, an enormous tribute, acknowledging the later Jin as a vassal state. The Liao now ruled millions of Chinese subjects, sophisticated urban populations, farmers, merchants, scholars. This was different from ruling Khitan tribes or conquered Bohai. This was managing the most advanced civilization in East Asia. Taizong was careful. He did not try to force Chinese subjects to become Khitan. He maintained Chinese local administration. Chinese officials continued serving. Chinese law continued operating. Buddhism and Confucianism remained protected, but ultimate authority rested with the Liao emperor. Taxes flowed north. Military garrisons ensured compliance. Strategic strongpoints had Khitan commanders. The appearance of continuity masked the reality of foreign rule. It was occupation, but sophisticated occupation. The Liao understood that ruling Chinese populations required working with Chinese systems, not destroying them. With the 16 prefectures secured, the Liao Empire reached its peak territorial extent, from Manchuria to the edge of the Yellow River, from the Gobi Desert to the sea. Millions of subjects, multiple ethnicities, vast resources. Taizong had done what his father started, built an empire that could stand as China's equal. The Liao capital itself embodied the dual nature of the empire. The city was actually two cities, a northern Khitan section where traditional life continued. Yurts, horse markets, shamanistic rituals, and a southern Chinese section. Grid layout, Confucian schools, Buddhist temples, markets selling silk and tea. Both worlds, one empire, neither fully Chinese, neither fully nomadic. Something unique. But here was the truly unique aspect of Liao governance. The emperor did not stay in one capital. The Liao maintained 5 capitals spread across the empire, and the imperial court migrated between them seasonally. Spring in the supreme capital, summer in the eastern capital near Bohai territory, autumn in the central capital, winter in the southern capital near the 16 prefectures. The emperor and court, thousands of people packed up and moved, following ancient Khitan migration patterns. But now, as an empire, Chinese officials found this bizarre. Emperors were supposed to stay in palaces, rule from fixed capitals, not live in tents and move with the seasons. But the Liao insisted. This was who they were, nomadic people who happened to rule an empire. They would not give up movement, freedom, the sky and grass. The Khitan also maintained their traditional practices, the great autumn hunts, entire sections of territory set aside as imperial hunting grounds. The emperor and nobles rode out, hunted deer, wild boar, wolves, lived in tents for weeks, competed in archery and horsemanship. These were not just recreation. They were military training, cavalry skills maintenance, political bonding, demonstrations of Khitan identity, reminders that beneath the Chinese robes and administrative titles, they remained horse people. Chinese officials were expected to participate. Many were terrible riders. They bounced awkwardly in saddles, shot arrows that missed by yards. The Khitan found this amusing. The Chinese found it humiliating. But it reinforced who held real power. An empire run by people who could ride and shoot, not scholars who could only write. But a new challenge was emerging. In 960, China unified again. A brilliant general named Zhao Kuang-yin seized power, founded the Tang Dynasty. Within a decade, he conquered the fractured kingdoms that had divided China since the Tang collapse. China was one again, powerful again, and the Song dynasty wanted the 16 prefectures back. From the Song perspective, this was Chinese territory occupied by barbarians, a national humiliation that had to be rectified. They had the population, the economy, the resources. They would take back what was theirs. The Liao had other ideas. The 16 prefectures were theirs by treaty, paid for with military support. They had held them for decades, administered them, defended them. They were not giving them back. Collision was inevitable. In 979, the Song emperor personally led an invasion. A massive army, sources claim over 100,000 soldiers marched north to retake the 16 prefectures. The Liao met them at the Gaoliang River. Liao cavalry devastated the Song forces. Mobile horse archers circled the Song infantry, shot from impossible angles, retreated before the Song could respond, struck again from a different direction. The Song army broke, fled. The emperor himself was wounded by an arrow, had to escape in a donkey cart. A humiliating detail that Chinese historians tried to suppress, but Liao records gleefully preserved. The Song tried again, and each time, Liao cavalry tactics proved superior. light mobile horsemen against heavy infantry, speed against mass, mobility against fortifications. The Song could not retake the 16 prefectures. After decades of conflict, both sides were exhausted. The Song could not defeat the Liao militarily. The Liao could not conquer Song territory. They lacked the numbers and siege capacity to take fortified Chinese cities en masse. In 14, they negotiated the Treaty of Shanyuan, a peace agreement that would last over a century. The terms: the Liao kept the 16 prefectures. The Song recognized Liao sovereignty over this territory. In return, the Song would pay the Liao annual tribute, 100,000 taels of silk, 200,000 bolts of silk. Every year, the Chinese called it a gift, face-saving language, but everyone understood it was tribute. The Song was paying the Liao not to invade, acknowledging the Liao as equals or even superiors. The Shanyuan Treaty was one of the most important agreements in East Asian history. It established the Liao and Song as equal sovereign states, dual emperors, neither subordinate to the other. This was revolutionary. For centuries, China had claimed to be the center of civilization, the son of heaven. All other rulers were supposedly vassals, barbarians who might be powerful but were never equal. The Liao forced China to abandon this fiction. At least diplomatically, the treaty used equal terminology: brother emperors, equal status, mutual respect. It was a diplomatic revolution, a barbarian empire forcing China to recognize parity. And the tribute payments made the Liao wealthy. 300,000 units of silver and silk every year that funded armies, palaces, Buddhist monasteries, scholarship, the arts. The Liao used their wealth to build one of the great Buddhist civilizations of East Asia, hundreds of monasteries, thousands of monks, libraries filled with Buddhist texts in Chinese, Sanskrit, and Khitan translation. The Liao emperors were enthusiastic Buddhist patrons. They commissioned massive printing projects, woodblock printing of entire Buddhist canons. Some of these printed texts survive today, among the earliest examples of large-scale printing in world history. Buddhism served multiple purposes. It was genuine religious devotion. Many Liao emperors and nobles were sincere believers. But it was also diplomacy. Buddhist monks traveled between Liao and Song freely. Cultural exchange when political relations were tense. Ideas, texts, and art crossed borders that armies could not. And Buddhism helped integrate the diverse Liao population. Khitan nomads, Chinese farmers, Bohai remnants, other tribal groups, all could worship together in Buddhist temples. A unifying force in a multi-ethnic empire. The Liao also developed a sophisticated scholarly culture. Khitan nobles studied Chinese classics alongside traditional Khitan oral literature. They learned both Khitan scripts and Chinese characters. They wrote poetry in both languages. Some Liao scholars achieved genuine literary excellence. Their poetry was admired even in Song China. Chinese intellectuals grudgingly admitted that these barbarians could write as well as any Chinese. The Liao court also sponsored scientific work, astronomical observations, calendar making, medical texts, mathematical treatises. They translated Chinese scientific works into Khitan, preserved knowledge, advanced understanding. This was not simply copying Chinese culture. It was synthesis, creating something new from multiple traditions. Khitan political structures, Chinese administrative methods, Buddhist philosophy, steppe military tactics, urban Chinese economic systems, a hybrid civilization, neither Chinese nor nomadic, both and neither, uniquely Liao. At its peak in the mid-11th century, the Liao Empire was one of the great powers of East Asia. They received embassies from Korea, which paid tribute, from various Central Asian tribes seeking alliances, even from Japan, which sent diplomatic missions. The Song Dynasty, despite being larger and wealthier, treated the Liao as equals. The annual payments continued. Border trade flourished. Cultural exchange was extensive. The Liao had achieved something remarkable. A nomadic people had built an empire that could stand alongside China, force China to recognize them as equals, create a sophisticated hybrid civilization, last for centuries. But nothing lasts forever. Chapter 5. The Seeds of Decline. By the late 11th century, problems were accumulating. The Liao Empire had been stable for so long that complacency set in. Emperors who had never known hardship, nobles who inherited positions without proving themselves, officials more interested in luxury than administration, the military, once the pride of the empire, was declining. The annual song tribute meant less need for military readiness. Why maintain difficult cavalry training when peace was profitable? Why live in tents seasonally when palaces were comfortable? Some Khitan nobles became completely Sinicized, spoke only Chinese, preferred Chinese poetry to horseback riding, wore Chinese robes exclusively, forgot how to shoot bows. The old warrior culture was fading. The hybrid nature that made the Liao unique was tilting too far toward Chinese civilization. The Khitan were losing what made them Khitan. And to the north, in the forests of Manchuria, a new power was rising. The Jurchen, a people related to the Khitan but distinct. Forest hunters, fishermen, iron workers, tough, hardy, ambitious. The Liao had subjugated many Jurchen tribes, made them vassals, extracted tribute. The Jurchen resented this. They saw the Liao growing soft, weak, distracted by Chinese luxury. A Jurchen leader named Aguda began uniting the tribes, building an army, training warriors, forging weapons, planning. The Liao leadership noticed but did not take it seriously. Barbarians in the forests. Surely they could be controlled with a show of force. Maybe some punitive raids. Nothing major. This was catastrophic underestimation. In 1114, the Jurchen rose in open rebellion. Aguda declared independence, proclaimed himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Jin. Golden. The Liao sent armies to crush the rebellion. These armies were destroyed. The Jurchen were better trained, better motivated. They fought in forests and mountains where Liao cavalry advantages disappeared. They used superior iron weapons. They were hungry for victory. Battle after battle, the Liao lost. Commanders were killed. Armies scattered. Territory fell. The empire that had dominated northern Asia for 2 centuries was being ripped apart by people they had considered barbarians. The Liao panicked, turned to their old rival, the Song dynasty. The irony was bitter. The Liao had forced the Song to pay tribute for over a century, had humiliated Chinese armies repeatedly. Now the Liao were begging for Song help against the Jurchen. The Song saw opportunity. They proposed an alliance, the Sea Alliance, named for the sea route the envoys used to avoid Jurchen-controlled territory. The terms, Song and Liao would attack the Jin together. When the Jurchen were defeated, the Liao would cede the 16 prefectures to the Song, finally returning the territories taken almost 200 years earlier. The Liao had no choice. They agreed. The alliance was formed. It was one of the worst decisions in Liao history. The alliance failed catastrophically. The Song armies, despite their numbers, proved incompetent. They had not fought a serious war in generations. Their soldiers were poorly trained, their commanders inexperienced, their tactics outdated. The Song attacked Jurchen positions and were slaughtered again and again. The Jurchen, hardened by years of warfare, destroyed Song forces effortlessly. Meanwhile, the Liao forces, already weakened, could not compensate for Song failure. The combined offensive collapsed. The Jurchen counterattacked, captured more territory, moved closer to the Liao heartland. The Song, realizing the Liao were doomed, made a separate peace with the Jurchen, betrayed their ally, cut a deal to divide Liao territory between them. By 1125, the Jurchen were besieging Liao capitals. The supreme capital fell. The central capital fell the west, desperately trying to escape, carrying what treasures they could, abandoning everything else. The last Liao emperor, Tianzuo, fled into the western steppes, tried to rally support, gather armies, launch a counteroffensive. But the empire was fragmenting. Generals surrendered to save their troops. Nobles fled to save their families. Chinese subjects welcomed the Jurchen as liberators from Khitan rule. The Liao Dynasty was collapsing. 210 years from Abaoji's coronation to this, ending in smoke and chaos. Tianzuo was captured in 1126. The Jurchen found him in the mountains, brought him to their capital in chains. The last emperor of the Liao Dynasty, paraded as a trophy, a lesson to anyone who might resist Jin power. He died in captivity 9 years later, forgotten. The empire he had inherited and lost was already becoming a historical footnote. The Jin dynasty absorbed most of Liao territory. The Song took the 16 prefectures, finally recovering them after nearly 2 centuries. The Liao Empire was gone, erased from the map. But that was not quite the end of the story. A Khitan prince named Liao Dynasty refused to accept defeat. He gathered thousands of Khitan refugees, loyal troops, nobles who would not bow to the Jurchen, and he led them west across the steppes, into Central Asia. Thousands of miles from their homeland, they were going into exile. But Dashi had a plan. Central Asia was in chaos. The Seljuk Turks dominated. but were fighting among themselves. Smaller kingdoms competed for power. Dashi saw opportunity. He would build a new empire, far from the Jurchen, far from China. The Khitan would survive, adapt, transform again. Between 1124 and 1134, Dashi did the impossible. He conquered a vast territory in Central Asia, defeated the Western Karakhanid Khanate, crushed the Seljuk army sent against him, established a new empire, the Kara Cathay, the Western Liao, a reborn Khitan empire thousands of miles from their homeland. Dashi ruled as Gur Khan, Universal Khan. He established a capital at Balasagun in modern Kyrgyzstan, created an administration combining Khitan methods with Central Asian practices, collected tribute from conquered peoples. The Kara Cathay would last another century, rule over Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, and Zoroastrians, become a major power on the Silk Road, and eventually inspire European legends of Prester John, a Christian king in the East. Though the Khitan were not Christian, European crusaders heard rumors of a powerful Eastern empire defeating Muslims and assumed it must be Christian allies. The Khitan had done it again, built an empire from nothing, adapted to completely new circumstances, ruled over peoples with different languages, religions, and cultures, maintained their identity while synthesizing with new influences. From Manchurian nomads to emperors of northern China to rulers of Central Asia, 3 different empires, 3 different contexts, but always Khitan at the core. It was remarkable, almost unprecedented, a people refusing to disappear, adapting, surviving, building. But even the Kara Cathay could not last forever. In the early 13th century, a new power rose on the eastern steppes, the Mongols. Led by Genghis Khan, the Mongols conquered the Kara Cathay between 1211 and 1218, absorbed their territory into the growing Mongol Empire. The last Khitan emperor was deposed. The dynasty ended. 3 Khitan empires: the original Liao in Manchuria and northern China, the failed Rum state under Tianzhuo, the Kara Cathay in Central Asia. All gone by 1218, the Khitan as an independent political force were finished, but their influence would echo for centuries more. Chapter 6: Echoes and Memory. The Khitan people did not vanish when their empires fell. They scattered, intermarried with Mongols, Chinese, Jurchens. Some maintained distinct Khitan identity for centuries. Khitan tribes were recorded in Mongolia and Manchuria as late as the 17th century. Khitan culture influenced the Mongols profoundly. Mongol administration borrowed heavily from Liao models. The Mongol script was based partly on Khitan writing systems. Khitan officials served the Mongol Yuan dynasty in China, passed on their expertise. The Khitan had pioneered the dual administration system, one for nomadic peoples, one for settled populations. The Mongols expanded this into the largest empire the world had ever seen, and the name lived on in the most unexpected way. Khitan became Cathay. Turkic languages turned it into Khitai. Russian adopted this as Cathay, still the Russian word for China. Medieval Europeans heard the name through Silk Road merchants. Cathay, the legendary Eastern Empire, Marco Polo's destination. For centuries, Europeans debated whether Cathay and China were the same place. Jesuits in the 16th century finally confirmed they were, but the name persisted. Cathay Pacific Airlines. Cathayan, the poetic name for China in English. A nomadic people from Manchuria gave China one of its most enduring names in world languages. The Khitan disappeared, but their name echoes still. For centuries, the Khitan were nearly forgotten. Chinese histories dismissed them as barbarians. Brief footnotes. Northern nuisances. The Qing Dynasty, which conquered China in the 17th century, were themselves from Manchuria. They knew the Khitan story, but did not emphasize it. Only in the 20th century did scholars begin serious study of the Liao Dynasty. Archaeological excavations uncovered Liao tombs, cities, artifacts. Khitan script was partially deciphered, though much remains mysterious. The scope of the Liao achievement became clear. A nomadic people who built an empire, forced China to recognize equality, created a hybrid civilization, survived their empire's fall to build another empire thousands of miles away, gave China a name that echoes worldwide. Today, the Liao Dynasty is recognized as one of the significant empires of medieval Asia. Scholars study Khitan script, culture, administration. Museums display Liao artifacts. Academic conferences debate Liao influence on Chinese and Central Asian history. The hybrid model the Liao pioneered, allowing different populations to maintain distinct identities under one empire, prefigured the Mongol and Qing approaches to ruling diverse territories. The concept of dual sovereignty, of equal emperors, influenced East Asian diplomacy for centuries, and the Khitan demonstrated something profound about identity and survival. A people can lose their homeland, lose their empire, be scattered across continents, and yet persist, adapt, rebuild, leave marks on history that endure long after political power fades. The grasslands where the Khitan once rode are quiet now. The great capitals are ruins, if anything. The palaces return to earth. The yurts long since scattered to wind. But the story remains, carried in names, in archaeological fragments, in the hybrid models of empire they pioneered, in the word Cathay, still spoken around the world. The Khitan created writing to preserve their identity, so they would not be forgotten, so their stories would outlast their power. For centuries, it seemed to fail. The Khitan script fell out of use, was forgotten, became undecipherable. Their histories were written by enemies who diminished them. Their achievements were attributed to others or dismissed. But stone remembers what people forget. Archaeological work continues. More Khitan inscriptions are found. Scholars piece together the language, reconstruct the history, give voice to the silenced. The Khitan are speaking again, across centuries, telling us who they were. The Silk Road routes the Khitan controlled, the trade networks they protected, the cultural exchanges they facilitated. These connected East and West in ways that shaped world history. Chinese silk reached Europe along routes the Liao secured. Buddhist texts traveled from India through Liao territory to Korea and Japan. Persian science reached China through Khitan intermediaries. Ideas, technologies, religions, all flowing along paths the Khitan maintained. They were brokers, bridge builders, neither fully of the steppe nor fully of China, but connected to both. Their hybrid nature made them perfect intermediaries between worlds. When we trace the threads of global connection in medieval times, we find Khitan fingerprints everywhere. The Liao Dynasty existed at the same time as the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Golden Age, the Holy Roman Empire, medieval Japan, the Song Dynasty in China, the Chola Dynasty in India. When we place the Liao in global context, their achievement becomes even more remarkable. They were not some minor barbarian kingdom on China's frontier. They were one of the major powers of the medieval world, controlling vast territory, ruling millions, creating sophisticated administrative systems, patronizing art and culture, maintaining large armies, conducting complex diplomacy. The fact that they were written out of history says more about who writes history than about their actual importance. The steppe cultures persist, not as empires, but as ways of life. Modern Mongolians still herd, still move with seasons, though with motorcycles and trucks now, still live in jurs, still ride horses, still know the sky and grass. The Khitan political power is gone, but the culture they came from continues, adapted, modernized, but recognizably connected to that ancient pastoral tradition. Perhaps that is the real legacy, not the empire, not the conquered territories, but the demonstration that mobile pastoral peoples can create sophisticated civilizations without abandoning who they are. You do not have to settle to be civilized. You do not have to build permanent cities to have culture and learning. You do not have to give up the horse and the tent to matter in history. The Khitan proved that. And it matters still. The Khitan story is being taught now in universities across the world, in China, in Mongolia, in Europe and America. Students who have never heard of the Liao Dynasty are learning. They are learning that history is more complex than the simple narratives, that barbarians built sophisticated empires, that cultural synthesis creates innovation, that being conquered does not erase a people's achievements. Young scholars from China, Mongolia, Korea, Central Asia, the West, are studying Khitan script, excavating Liao sites, writing dissertations on topics that were considered unimportant decades ago. The Khitan are being remembered, and every act of remembering is an act of resistance against erasure. Every empire falls, every capital crumbles, every dynasty ends, but knowledge, once created, can be recovered. Stories, once told, can be retold. Names, once spoken, echo across centuries. The Khitan created writing so they would not be forgotten. For 800 years, it seemed they had failed. The script was lost, the histories dismissed, the achievements erased. But now, the lamp burns again. The books are opened. The story is told. And perhaps that is enough. The sun rises over the grasslands as it has for millions of years, as it will for millions more. The Khitan rode here once, built cities, made empires, changed history. Now the grass grows, the wind blows, the rivers flow, the mountains stand, and the story is told, remembered, honored. What are empires but stories we tell? What is history but remembering? The Khitan built in stone and iron, but what survives is the story, carried on the wind, scattered like seeds, taking root in unexpected soil, a nomadic people who became emperors, who forced China to bow, who lost everything and built again, who gave the world a name that echoes still. Cathay, the grass remembers, the wind remembers, the stones remember, and now, perhaps, so do we. The night settles over the steppes. The ancient lands are quiet. Somewhere a river flows that the Khitan knew. Somewhere a mountain stands that they saw. Somewhere, buried beneath the grass, stones bear their writing. The empires are gone. The palaces are dust. The armies are memory. But the story lives. From the northern forests to the Chinese plains, from Manchuria to Central Asia, from the grasslands to the history books, the Khitan journey continues. Not in power, but in remembrance. They were nomads who built empires, horsemen who created culture, warriors who wrote poetry, a people who refused to be only one thing, who synthesized, who adapted, who survived. Their cities fell, but their name became Cathay, and Cathay is eternal. The stars wheel overhead, the same stars they watched. The grass grows tall, the same grass their horses ate. The wind blows free, the same wind that filled their tents. And somewhere in the darkness, if you listen carefully, you might hear the distant sound of hoofbeats. Riders who became emperors. Emperors who never forgot they were riders. The Khitan Liao Dynasty. Nomads who built an empire and then became something more than empire. They became legend. They became name. They became story. And the story, once told, never truly ends. The wind carries it onward, across the grass, across the centuries, across the silence. Cathay, the night deepens, the story sleeps. And perhaps, gentle listener, so should you.